Welcome back. This is part two of the slides. And I want to talk a little bit more about how we report our findings and discuss our findings. And again, as pointed out in our article that I assigned, sometimes these are combined, but often just based on convention, they might be separate. So it's definitely a stylistic thing. It's nothing to think about too much. But when you're going to report findings from a qualitative study, it's important to understand what you're reporting and how you're going to discuss it. So one of the main things to think about, and again, this is another article by Sandalowski. She does a lot of great work in terms of giving feedback and giving insight into how you report your findings. We're trying to interpret what we have seen in our analysis and not just show data. And what I find in a lot of articles that I don't like or first drafts from doctoral students who are doing dissertations is that they will give a little bit of analysis, a little bit of understanding of how they analyze their data, but then it's just followed up by a bunch of quotes from the data to back up what they've said instead of interpreting what the data say. So it's one thing to have some quotes, some data backing up what you're saying. It's another thing to just list out a bunch of data or quotes so that your reader has to interpret it or analyze it or summarize it. And again, what you're trying to do is break down the data into these concepts and then bring them back together in an interpreted or summarized way. Okay. Sometimes you might report your findings based on a chronological order, and that might just emerge in your data. And I'll show you an example of that in these slides. You might talk about how many times themes or concepts are revealed within your data set. Now, these aren't based on a representative sample or anything like that, so you can't say that the prevalence of what you're finding will match to other populations, but you might just show how prevalent, how often you heard the same thing over and over again, or something that you found to be salient, but maybe only a few people found, reported on these, and it's something that we need to look at further in the future. So prevalence tables where you might have your theme and then the number of people or a number of times they're said, it can be interesting. You can also display things in terms of comparisons. Comparisons might be how people of certain age groups define an experience, like maybe travel. Do older people have different ways of looking at how they feel about travel versus younger people? Or in terms of, again, developing theory or metaphors or frameworks. And I'd like to show you a framework or a theory from that same study conducted by the student about military veterans becoming students at UAF. And she asked about what made it easy or hard, what were the facilitating or challenging factors. And she has these listed out, but she again developed put her findings in terms of the social ecological framework. And so you can see that she used her framework not only in her developing her questions, but she also used it in terms of how she structured her data findings, in terms of what are things that are facilitating or challenging at the individual level, the relational level, or the organizational or cultural level. And again, you'll have examples of this. You have this example in Blackboard. From that study where I showed you the abstract, they also were able to create a theory that is grounded in their data. And here they say, the result was a theoretical model explaining counselors' and nurses' attempts to find ways out for teenage girls with this idea of protecting their family honor. The finding was that the staff felt that they felt professionally hampered as they could not always solve problems in regular ways. And here, figure 1 shows how they were able to put their data together in some kind of conceptual framework, not necessarily a causal framework, but just how things seem to be together, from biggest issues to smaller things. And so they didn't just list this, they had to interpret it for us. And so let's focus on feeling professionally hampered. So they give a good amount of information about what they found to be regarded as feeling professionally hampered. And then they focused on each aspect, each sub theme that they found within that bigger theme. And here we see they talk about difficulty in interpreting seriousness of the situation. So here they talk about that, and they give a quote. They give some data to back up their interpretation. That's not the only quote, it's not the only data, but they found one that was very salient and talked about it. And as you can see here, they labeled the quote by saying this was from the counselor at one of the schools. So we were able to see, if you looked across the paper, that different counselors said different things. It wasn't just one person, giving their take on things, and that their information was more important than others. Also, metaphors are important. Here, I worked with a student, Krista Koo, on a qualitative study that that was focused on people who had experienced other people's suicides and how it felt to talk about it. So, the basis of this paper was that when we were trying to get the study through our institutional review board for ethics, they were worried about us talking about this with students. And so at the end of their interview, we needed to ask them, after doing this interview, do you feel the same, worse, or better? And can you tell us why? And that became a whole data set in itself, which was really, really wonderful to add to the literature, where we found that for the people, almost everybody said that they felt better or the same. And they gave us the reasons why. And that seemed to bloom out as a metaphor for us. We found things that were foundational for them in terms of talking about somebody else's suicide, that they started with this exposure and they had thought or talked about it before, that they needed to process through it. So there were barriers to communication and ways of talking about suicide. And that there were these outcomes that came from going from this foundation to this processing to these outcomes that had a therapeutic effect for them, that they had this realization that they actually had a new insight to share and to help and give back to others. And from that, as we talked about it as a group of researchers, we started thinking about this tree. It was a metaphor of a tree where there were branches, the base of the tree, the trunk, and then the outcome being the branches and the leaves going in different directions. So there, from our data, which was not even what we were looking at, we wound up, finding this whole data set within this just added extra small part of a research project that really added to the literature. And then here's that model that came from data that I said that showed chronological order. So we were asking people in a Yupik communities what it was like to experience stress and how they cope with stress. But in Yupik, there is no word for stress. So we had to start defining stress. And we saw that when people talked about stress, they talked about it in sort of a chronological way. When you talk to a bunch of people, what our findings were very sort of going into this chronological way of looking at stress, where there were these antecedents, these things that were before the stress, things that were the causes of stress or the changes that they saw in terms of stress from a long time ago to the stressors of now. And then they talked specifically about some stressful experiences and how resources either, helped or made it hard to respond to stress, and then the overall effects of stress on themselves and on their communities. So here we were able to look at our data and how we were coding things, but put them together in this chronological sort of conceptual framework. And then finally, one of the studies I have conducted was with cancer survivors, and I asked them about what makes it easier or hard to survive cancer. And almost everybody, 29 out of the 24, discussed these traditional means of coping. And they were talking about it in terms of a sort of a subsistence. And the way we interpreted that by looking across their data was that they interpreted subsistence as activities and lifestyle associated with hunting, fishing, and gathering, and the use of subsistence products. And so each one of these was then defined with data to back it up. So we talk about connection to the land, and we give the data from one survivor who expressed, I try to get out in the woods every day. That's my number one healing spot, is out in the woods. So we did that for each part of this subsistence circle. So it's not a causal circle where one thing leads to the other, but I was able to see how they connected, how this was a very salient theme because so many people in this group talked about it at length in terms of subsistence helping them with their survival. So I'm going to stop here and then we'll continue on.